Today we're exploring the consumer or modernity, but look at it through the lens of nativist revivals or forms of nationalism, and also the way how this connects into, say, indigenous claims, say within particular countries they've had colonial projects, as it were, and so the way how they both share a secret affinity to actually just to preserve the paradigm of modernity. And so if we look at it along these lines, what I hope to explore is that these are set up in a way where you have, if you think that a lot of people that invest in, say, movements to do with reconciliation, or the way how reconciliation gets framed, say, within Australia, and land rights is for the left. Obviously, any person that's looking at, say, people that are coming outside of the country, so looking at immigration as an issue, nationalism is given to the right. And so what you have is that you have the scenario that you have two ways of approaching justice that completely misses the mark, when what you're dealing with has ultimately nothing to do with the particular country, but with a spirituality that is transcendent to country or to borders. That's not to say that you cannot address the spiritual disease in place, but if you are orientated into place through either through First Peoples or through nationalisms, or either way, then you're ultimately not addressing the nature of the no place that you're beholden to. So we always talk about the fact that when you spiritualize time, you introduce a disincarnating creed. Now this applies to both indigenous peoples, however the way you want to fucking describe that, and obviously people that are, say, the descendants of people that have come to a particular country, so being a prime example. And so if we're both settler and not indigenous alike are subjected to the same totalizing claim of a buyer's journey, then the way how people, say, invest in their identities as First Peoples, well, their ancestors never fucking walked a buyer's journey. And so the way how that they hold themselves up as somehow being emblematic or embodying what their ancestors, a connection to their ancestry, is absolutely fucking ridiculous, just as much as what the people on the right, however you want to do it, however you would explain this, are always also the same, because you're dealing with the same spiritual disease. And so if you look at it marginally, well, you're only looking at your identity marginally. So the marginality of identity in this case, well, you've got the conduit for the right and you've got the conduit for the left. And so you're still investing in your redundancy, but you sell yourself otherwise because it's literally just a value add. And if it's a value add, then the totalizing claim or the command economy persists. And so the disconnect between both left and right is to do with the question of spirituality. And I always talk about, being an Australian, is that the reconciliation is nothing political, it's a spiritual issue. And if it's a spiritual issue, it's the way how that you would walk or be initiated. And so we can look at this in a way where, the way I frame this is that you're dealing with the nature of a transcendental truth claim, and you're never good enough. You atone for being born, because through the transition from the child to the adult, ultimately you use a credit you are not the originator of, and so therefore your actions are animated by a false transcendence that's set up. Compare that to nativists, compare that to ancient peoples, all right, and their initiation rites. This relates specifically to men and to boys in particular. So a boy, and if we look at Australia, they've got the walkabout rite. So the walkabout rite is where they're endowed the wisdom of their elders, and so therefore when they go out in the bush, they fend for themselves, and so therefore they have to be orientated towards the landscape or the country of their forebears in a way where they can provide for themselves. And so you think of the transition of knowledge that is necessary in order for that child to come back as a man. Do we have any initiations like that? And obviously we know we don't. So if you look at it along the lines, you have essentially what you've got. You've got a buyer's journey, that's a totalizing claim, it's an imperial form of life, right? The consumer is, and so they're totalizing claim of that way of life. And then you have what I called, well, what is a walkabout. And the walkabout is an initiation rite, and a buyer's journey is an expiation rite. And they're your choices. So if you look at it along those lines, so look at it from the perspective of, once again, the natalist claims to identity and to nationhood. And so First Nations, the same thing, back to connecting to their ancestry onto the land of their ancestors. If there's a buyer's journey that's been set for those aspirations, how can you temporalise place in either scenario? Like, how can you? When you think that if you're using money that your ancestors never used to animate your actions as money making, then the way how that you're orientated towards the place of your ancestors is as a buyer's journey. All right, so then how can, and even if, let's say, for instance, that you go and hunt game, say, on a reservation, like if we can use the United States as an example, or maybe Canada or something like that, you're still beholden to the same machine that surrounds this little island, as it were. And so therefore, how do you, where's the interface, all right, when you're looking at what are you creating with other people that are given in the same way? So when they're given in the same way, it's got nothing to do with your identity. The form of life is transcendent to the way how you sell yourself otherwise. This is the issue. So your spirituality, if it's connected to an identity, is based upon the violence of exclusion. And so therefore you think, okay, well, you need to have boundaries, all right, in order to preserve, obviously, a way of life. But then it comes down to not all cultures are born the same. So you have to look at, well, what is the principal thing that you're orientated towards if you want to express, say, your spirit, as it were. And this is the key. You could look at it along those lines, because then if your spirit is a ancestral spirit that is connected to place, well, it's in reference to, obviously, your clan, your ethnic group, your tribe, as it were. And so therefore, by default of it being a form of tribalism, ultimately you work on the distinction based upon the identity. And so therefore you cannot look at the earth as being singular, but in such a way where the great spirit that animates your actions you would do justice to that. But then how can you, when what you do is that you've got the borders and the boundaries that you find yourself in, born wherever you are on the planet, how can you engage with animating, say, not an artistic kind of spirit, but ultimately one that is more an earth spirit? So that question, that means to say the question of spirituality, all right, it's the same irrespective of where you are on the face of the planet. So what you need to do, and this is the issue here, is that if through the liberal paradigm you've got this system that obviously monopolizes truth and becomes ultimately it's a religious kind of it's a form of religiosity. It obviously has its own orthodoxy, and so Western countries are the ones that are dealing with the spirituality, the spiritual disease of modernity, the no place of modernity. Modernity has obviously gone right around the globe and obviously marginalised, say, if we look at, say, Indigenous peoples' different ways of doing or being. And that's not to say that there's any validity in with the idea of their knowledge, or their knowledge you could have, say, could be connected to place, and so therefore it has some obviously utility in reference to that, but not when you're dealing with a spirituality that is all encompassing. There's nothing that of Indigenous wisdom actually can address this, because the nature of obviously of the spiritual disease is something that they are not really, the majority of people just do not know the cause of. And so if you work back from that as a key difference, well, obviously places that have been subjected to modernity the longest are the ones where their spiritual yearning is the deepest. You have to obviously demonize people in these places for the fact that there is the most potential for change. And that change is not to say that that change will reverberate across the globe, because ultimately if you start to understand what it is that you're dealing with, then other people in other areas of the planet recognize the affinity that they have with other people. And so if you're addressing, you're a person in Europe, let's say, and I don't know, you're a Native American or whatever somewhere, and yet you know that the same disease is what, you're beholden to a no place. So how do you temporalize place when your actions are animated by a false transcendence. It's the same action. But what you do is that if you know that, then you can be orientated towards a place where you do justice to your ancestry. And then what you do is that you have a different perfume or nuance, even though the actions are exactly the same. Because I always come back to that, you're the product, and it doesn't matter the way you sell yourself on your identity in any way, shape or form. So what that enables you to look at is that, well, if there is different ideologies that are inimical, we could say, or are, say, xenophobic, are elitist in this way, then you have to appraise basically different civilizational domains on their merits. And you don't have to obviously accommodate them if ultimately what drives people's actions, they become fucking religious zealots. And so I always frame religious zealotry, and there's lots of religious zealotry, but you know, one of the most virulent forms of religious zealotry is monist thought or monotheism. And so the redemptive history that's given, that you can basically connect Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, because if there's the one true God, all right, and then you look at what that means, and then the redemption is in reference to Eden and some kind of original crime scene, and yet you proclaim that there is only one true God, and you know, and so there is a whole narrative that it's built around this thing. There's obviously, it builds in just total intolerance to any forms of spirituality that is connected to place. But what happens in that context is that you have the revival of, say, paganism, especially within Europe, that is obviously inextricably connected to place, or you go into like, say, Canada or the Canada or wherever, Canada or any place where Europeans have been. Obviously, you've got the native people that are obviously wanting to have a connection to place, their ancestral lands, in the same kind of manner. But if you're not addressing the monist claim, all right, over existence, which is got, it's essentially Egyptian. It's not even, it's Egyptian in origin, we could say. Then ultimately you're not dealing with the principal spiritual disease that has gone right around the globe. So what happens is that you'll get split off into two groups where you're fighting over justice, but then you're not looking at your existential status when you're given as a principal product that applies to both. So how can you offer in that context any form of reconciliation? What are you trying to reconcile? So think of that. What does that mean? You're trying to reconcile what? Grievance against the purveyors of history, which is obviously me being white and being male. I'm the devil incarnate, all right? I'm guilty just simply by being born, all right? And so therefore the grievance is held against me, let's say, or people like me, all right? Because supposedly our ancestors committed so many heinous crimes. There's nothing that we can do to atone, all right? And so therefore, as a result of that, you have to, Europe, let's say, has to become a shithole, like what, third world places, or place where they don't have a sense of, there's no maybe civilizational, say, dynamism that's there, we could say. You know, is that what it's meant to be? You're too successful, and so therefore you need to be taken down a peg, as it were. Well, what does that achieve? The only thing that would do in that case is just look at the nature of the spiritual disease, and then ultimately the what animates people's actions, and then ultimately the parasitism that is predicated upon its spiritual disease. So if people look at parasitism and you look at elitism, say especially within the West now, people get beholden to any kind of form of cabal or any great, basically, you know, they, all right? But once again, if you stand accused, all right, because you do it to yourself, because your actions are animated by a false transcendence, then and yet you don't know the way how that occurs, because through spiritualizing time, what you've done is you've absolved yourself of responsibility, and so the way how that you would become a wisdom keeper, like ancient peoples or ancient elders. Well, what's the wisdom that you can hand down to your descendants, as it were? And this applies both. This is the thing, it applies both, because I always talk about that you take the child is groomed to become a demand center, and so there's no wisdom. So like if we bring it back to the walkabout, So the child, when the child goes out in the bush, he's being educated in the ways of to be orientated towards the land in order to sustain his very existence. And so when he's out on his walkabout, he can come back. All right, so that transition, obviously from the child, he comes back as a man. He makes that transition. I think of the way how that we orientate our children to what there is their transition to an adult. There is no wisdom. And so the lack of wisdom applies to irrespective of wherever you go on the face of the planet. All right, why? Because people don't know the way how that they produce themselves as a principal product, or the way how that time has been spiritualized, immanentizes a spiritual disease that allows parasitism to rear its head, and then for people to be captured with the machinations of power, because they've disavowed the very power that animates their lives. And that applies to both parties. And so if you can't look at these issues having an affinity, a cultural affinity, they share a culture. They do. Well, what is that? Well, you're economizing. You're still a credit instrument. It doesn't matter. You're credited, like in the case of, say, any nativist claim, and it can be like First Nations or bloody whatever, it doesn't really matter. You're credited a limitation of agency, and so you use the very mechanism or the very avenue of, say, attaining some kind of justice that is managed. So therefore what it does, through it being managed, it preserves. And it preserves, what is it preserving? It's preserving the non-questioning. Where you are, when you're beholden to an unavowed utopianism, you immanentize no place. And it doesn't matter where you go. This is the one thing. It doesn't matter where you go, and therefore the borders and the boundaries and the way how you police the self is always in reference to something that you don't question. And so if you can't question it, then you won't question the nature of the way how you're orientated towards place, and the way how you have to potentialize you as your spirit. You have to transform the self from a consumer to a co-creator, from a passive credit instrument to animating a dynamism without end. And the way how you do that, obviously, that is a shared bequeathal. That is a singular action. And that's the way how that you'd be orientated towards a different spirituality, which is orientated towards revering the lost ancestor that connects all peoples. And this is what we'll explore further on.